Desert bloom. The desert held memories of things Sarah had never lived. Under that merciless Arizona sky of 1871, her small body was an abandoned island in the sea of sand and cacti. She had spent 3 days sitting beside the dry riverbed, watching how the absent water resembled her own destiny so much. The worn wooden trunk, sole witness to her previous existence, remained at her feet like a faithful dog. Inside, the few objects saved from the fever that took her parents: a silver brush with hair still tangled in its bristles, a prayer book with dog-eared corners, a Sunday dress never worn. Sarah contemplated her dirt-stained hands. They were hands that knew how to sew and knead bread, but had never learned to chart their own path. The wind lifted small whirlwinds before her, as if the earth were trying to speak to her in a language she didn't understand. 18 years of life turned to dust. The settlers had left her behind after burying her parents, fearful that the fever still dwelt within her. Loneliness was not a feeling but a thick substance that filled her throat. The sun began to rise, cruel and indifferent. Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't pray, but she listened. The desert's silence had textures and nuances she was beginning to recognize. Perhaps, she thought, dying here wouldn't be as terrible as dying in a place where she had never truly belonged. The sound came first as a vibration in the earth, then as a whisper of displaced sand. Sarah opened her eyes without alarm, like someone expecting the inevitable arrival of something that will change everything. A rider was approaching. In her delirium of thirst, she almost believed he was an extension of the landscape. The young man and the horse fused into a single mythical creature, emerging from the heat waves. The young man dismounted a few meters away. His face was sunburned, and his eyes were an imprecise color between gray and green like rainwater on stone. He appeared no older than 17, but his hands revealed the hardness of adult life. He stood watching her without speaking, like someone who finds a strange mirage and fears it will vanish if named. "You need to drink," he said finally. Extending a leather canteen, Sarah took the object without lifting her gaze. The water entered her body like a revelation, awakening every dormant cell. She hadn't drunk since the previous morning. When she returned the canteen, her fingers brushed the young man's, and that fleeting contact seemed more real than everything she had experienced in recent days. "My name is Daniel Brennan," he said, receiving the canteen. "I'm driving cattle north." Sarah nodded without offering her name in return. Words seemed to have dried up in her, just like the river. Daniel looked at the trunk and then at the horizon, as if calculating something only he could see. "There's an abandoned cabin 2 hours from here. It has a well," he added, as if that were all the description necessary for a home. The wind brought the scent of wet earth, though it hadn't rained in weeks. Sarah wondered if it was possible for the body to remember scents that announced changes, like animals that sense storms. "Sarah Mitchell," she said finally, pronouncing her name like someone unwrapping something fragile. "My parents died of fever." Daniel didn't respond with words. He simply nodded and bent down to take the trunk. His movements had the economy of someone who had learned that in the desert, every gesture costs energy. Sarah watched as he secured the trunk to the saddle. There were no questions about her past, no promises about the future, only the immediate present. Water, shelter, survival. She stood shaking the dust from her faded dress. As she mounted behind Daniel, she felt the warmth of the young man's body like a border between her and the implacable vastness of the desert. Sarah closed her eyes. The horse's rhythm began to mark a new time in her life, while the midday sun converted their shadows into a single figure outlined against the red earth. The cabin emerged from the earth as if it had grown from it. Walls of logs worn by time, a roof that tilted slightly eastward, a chimney of stones stacked without apparent harmony. For Sarah, accustomed to the orderly spaces of the family farm, that place seemed an improbable refuge, born from the desperation of some settler who had abandoned the dream of the West. The first days passed in a strange ballet of silences and shared tasks. Daniel repaired the fallen fence, cut firewood, disappeared for hours to return with some piece of small game. Sarah organized the interior, swept the dust that persistently filtered through the wooden cracks, learned to light the fire in the chimney without smoke flooding the room. The young woman observed Daniel's hands when he wasn't looking. They were hands that seemed to know the secret language of things, how to straighten a bent nail, how to sharpen a knife against a stone, how to calm a nervous horse with a light touch on the neck. Sarah had grown up surrounded by men who imposed their presence, who occupied space with authority. Daniel, in contrast, moved as if asking permission from the air. One afternoon, while mending a torn shirt of his, she found in the pocket a small wooden carving, a bird with outstretched wings, so small it fit in the palm of her hand. The work was delicate, unexpected in those hardened hands. She returned it to its place without mentioning it, but that night she observed how Daniel took out the figure and turned it between his fingers while contemplating the fire. "My father carved," he said suddenly, without taking his gaze from the flames. "He said that wood holds stories inside. You just have to find them." Sarah nodded, feeling that those words were a gift more valuable than any provision. It was the first time Daniel mentioned something personal, that he offered a window into his inner world. She wanted to respond with something equally meaningful, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she got up and searched in her trunk. She returned with a small jar containing seeds. "Prairie flowers," she explained, placing it on the table between them. "My mother collected them every autumn. She said that carrying spring in your pocket was an act of faith." Daniel took the jar and lifted it against the firelight. The seeds cast complex shadows on his hands. "We could plant them," he suggested, with a voice so low it seemed an escaped thought. Sarah felt something expand in her chest. It wasn't exactly hope, but the sensation that time was moving forward again after having stopped beside the dry riverbed. That night, for the first time since her parents' death, she slept without dreaming of fever and loss. Memory had shapes and textures for Sarah. Some mornings, she woke with the phantom weight of her mother's hand on her forehead, checking if the fever had gone down. Other times, it was the echo of her father's voice reciting Bible passages during storms, as if sacred words could contain the power of the furious sky. In the fourth week at the cabin, while washing clothes at the nearby stream, a particular scent transported her instantly. The homemade soap she was using had the same essence as the one her mother made. The memory struck her with such force that she had to sit on the bank, with her hands submerged in the cold water, allowing herself for the first time a silent but deep cry. She didn't hear Daniel's footsteps approaching. She only felt his presence when he sat beside her, without touching her, without speaking, offering only the solidity of his company. Sarah continued crying, but now her tears had a witness, and that made them more real, more liberating. "I saw them both die," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "First Papa, then Mama 3 days later. The fever consumed them from within like invisible fire." Daniel nodded, watching the water run between the stones. "My family disappeared in a fire when I was 12, he responded, as if exchanging one secret for another. "I was in town helping at the blacksmith's. When I returned, only ashes remained." Sarah observed Daniel's profile outlined against the afternoon light. This 17-year-old boy had lived 5 years with that pain, and yet he hadn't hardened like the earth during drought. He was still capable of offering water to a stranger, of repairing a cabin to give her shelter. "How?" Sarah began but stopped, unsure how to formulate the question. "How do you keep going?" Daniel completed the thought. "I don't know. One day you breathe because you must, the next because you can, and one day, without realizing it, you breathe because you want to." That night, Sarah extracted from her trunk a silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She contemplated it in the lamplight, running her finger over the floral engraving on the surface. Then, on impulse, she hung it on the wall next to the small window. It wasn't much, but it was an act of permanence. A silent declaration that this space was beginning to be something more than a temporary refuge. May arrived with premature heat that transformed the air into a thick substance. Sarah had planted the flower seeds beside the cabin door, in a small rectangle of earth that Daniel had fenced to protect them from wild animals. Each morning, before beginning her tasks, she checked the dark soil for the first sign of emerging life. Routine had woven between them an invisible net of understanding. They knew how to move through the cabin's reduced space without getting in each other's way, anticipated each other's needs without words, shared bread and stories with the same naturalness. Sarah discovered she could predict when Daniel would return from hunting by the way the mongrel dog that had appeared one day at the door, and which they simply called Dog, lifted his ears and looked toward the path. It was during one of those afternoons when Sarah realized she no longer thought about leaving. The realization surprised her while she was sewing a button on Daniel's shirt. Her fingers stopped on the worn fabric. It wasn't just about the security the cabin offered, nor the practicality of their silent arrangement. It was something deeper. For the first time in her life, she was choosing. She wasn't the daughter of the Mitchells, nor the orphan who inspired pity. She was Sarah, simply Sarah, making a decision about her own destiny. That night, while they ate the rabbit stew she had prepared, Sarah observed Daniel with a new gaze. The young man ate with the concentration of someone who had known hunger and respects food. The firelight cast changing shadows on his young face already marked by hard life. There was something beautiful in his way of existing, Sarah thought, something authentic that she had never found in the young men from town who courted her with rehearsed words. "Daniel," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "what will you do when summer ends?" He lifted his gaze from his plate, surprised by the question. He seemed to consider several answers before speaking. "Before I thought about continuing north, maybe to Montana," he responded finally. Now I'm not sure." Sarah felt warmth expand from her chest to her cheeks. It wasn't a declaration, but it contained a truth they were both beginning to recognize. Daniel's now included her presence. The future had become shared territory, though neither dared to name it completely. "The flowers will bloom soon," she said, offering a bridge between the present and that uncertain future. "I'd like to see them flower." Daniel nodded, and in that simple gesture Sarah read a promise. That night, before going to sleep at opposite ends of the cabin, he on an improvised cot, she in the only bed, their gazes met an instant longer than usual. There were no words or physical contact, but something fundamental had changed between them, as subtle and powerful as seeds, germinating invisibly beneath the earth. The message arrived with a traveler who stopped at the cabin to ask for water. He was a nervous-looking man with a shifty gaze, who handed Daniel a folded paper, while Sarah prepared coffee in the kitchen. When the traveler left, she noticed the tension in Daniel's shoulders as he read. "Bad news?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. Daniel folded the paper slowly, as if buying time could change its contents. "It's about Colonel Marcus Waverley," he responded finally. "He's asking about you." The name fell into the space between them like a stone in calm waters. Sarah had heard about Waverley, a former military man turned landowner with influence throughout the territory. It was said the government had sent him to pacify the region, but his methods inspired more fear than respect. "How does he know about me?" Sarah's voice sounded smaller than she would have liked. "Rumors travel faster than riders," Daniel responded, looking toward the window. "He says a single young woman shouldn't live without proper protection, that it's his duty as authority to ensure you're under appropriate guardianship." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what those words meant. During the journey with the settler caravan, she had seen how single women inevitably ended up under the care of powerful men. Turned into servants, into wives without choice, into property. "I won't go," she said with a firmness that surprised them both. Daniel nodded, but his expression revealed concern. Waverley isn't a man who accepts no for an answer. And he has the law on his side, or at least the men who interpret it. Sarah approached the window. Outside, the first prairie flowers were beginning to peek through the earth, small green dots that promised color and life. She had watered them every morning, had protected the sprouts from excessive sun. They were hers, like this new life she was beginning to build. This land belonged to settlers, she said, remembering something Daniel had mentioned weeks ago. Under the Homestead Act, isn't that right? What happened to them? They left 2 winters ago. Didn't survive the first drought, he responded. The property was abandoned. Technically, it could be claimed again. But I'm a single woman, Sarah completed, understanding the complexity of her situation. That night, sitting before the fire, Sarah ran her finger along the outline of the silver locket. Her mother had always worn it, a wedding gift from her grandmother. Tradition dictated she should give it to her husband on their wedding day. The thought brought Daniel's image to her mind, and she felt unexpected warmth in her cheeks. At the other end of the room, Daniel carved wood with his knife. Sarah observed his hands moving with precision, slowly freeing a shape from the block. Another bird, this time perched on what appeared to be a flower. "Do you think he'll come?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Daniel stopped carving and lifted his gaze. In his eyes, Sarah saw a determination that conveyed more than any verbal promise. "If he comes, we'll find a solution," he responded simply. "This is your home now. No one will take you from here against your will." The word home resonated in Sarah's chest like a perfect musical note. Home. Not temporary refuge, not abandoned cabin, home. The place where decisions belonged to her, where planted seeds had the right to bloom. For the first time since the fever had taken her parents, Sarah felt she had something worth fighting for. The morning the first flowers opened their petals beside the door, a rider appeared on the horizon. It wasn't Waverley, but a woman about 50 years old with hair severely pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat. Sarah watched her dismount with the agility of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback. "Margaret Crawford," the woman introduced herself, extending a work-hardened hand. "I have a store in Copper Creek." Sarah shook her hand, noting the strength of the grip. Margaret entered the cabin as if she had been invited, evaluating the space with expert eyes. When Daniel returned from checking the traps, he seemed surprised but not alarmed by the woman's presence. "Mrs. Crawford," he greeted, removing his hat. "I didn't expect to see you so far from town." "Unusual times require unusual journeys," she responded, sitting at the table as if she owned the place. "I've come to talk about Waverley." The name altered the cabin's atmosphere. Margaret then told them what she knew. Waverley had sent men to escort Sarah to town, where she would be placed under his guardianship. The official excuse was the protection of a single woman in dangerous territory. But the real intentions were transparent to anyone who knew the man. "He sent letters to Washington denouncing illegal settlements," Margaret continued. "He wants all this land to expand his ranch. You're just a convenient obstacle in his path." Sarah felt the world narrowing around her. She had believed she had found a space of freedom, only to discover that the invisible walls of men's world still surrounded her. "What can we do?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with contained frustration. Margaret Crawford extracted a small black book from her bag and placed it on the table. "I'm a justice of the peace," she explained. "Appointed 5 years ago, when the county had no one else willing to ride 3 days to officiate a funeral or a wedding." The word wedding hung suspended in the air. Sarah looked at Daniel, whose eyes had widened slightly. The unspoken proposal was clear to everyone in the room. "A marriage would give you legal right to claim this land under the Homestead Act," Margaret continued, without beating around the bush. "And it would put Sarah beyond Waverley's reach. Legally, at least." Sarah felt her heart beating so loudly she feared others could hear it. Marriage had always been in her mind a distant future, something that would happen eventually as part of the natural order of things. Never an urgent decision, a survival strategy. I need to think," she said. Abruptly rising from the table and leaving the cabin, the hot midday air greeted her outside. Sarah headed to the small garden of flowers beginning to show their colors, yellows, whites, soft purples. She knelt beside them, gently touching the petals that had survived the aridity, that had found a way to bloom in impossible conditions. Inside the cabin, she could hear the muffled voices of Daniel and Margaret discussing practical details. The situation had a cruel irony. To escape Waverley's control, she had to surrender to another type of contract. Marriage, a word that enclosed centuries of traditions, expectations, rights, and duties. A word that would transform her relationship with Daniel forever, and yet as she ran her fingers through the earth zoo, surrounding the flowers, Sarah understood she had already made her decision days ago, perhaps even weeks. When she had hung her mother's locket on the wall, when she had decided she wanted to see the seeds bloom, when she had begun to call this place home, she stood, shook the earth from her skirt and, for the first time in a long while, knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. The ceremony was brief, held at sunset, when the golden light converted the cabin and its surroundings into something almost mythical. Margaret Crawford read the traditional passages from her small black book, while Sarah and Daniel stood before her, solemn and nervous. There was no ring. Instead, Sarah gave Daniel the silver locket, placing it in his open palm with trembling fingers. "It was my mother's," she explained in a low voice. "And her mother's before her." Daniel looked at it with amazement, understanding the value of the gesture. Then he took from his pocket the small carved bird perched on a flower. "I finished it last night," he said, offering it to Sarah. "It's not silver, but—" "It's perfect," she interrupted, taking the figure in her hands as if it were the most precious thing she had ever seen. Margaret Crawford watched them with an expression difficult to decipher, a mixture of approval and melancholy. When the time came to declare the marriage valid, the woman added words that weren't in the book. May you find in each other not only refuge, but freedom, not only company, but growth, and may this marriage, though born of necessity, bloom like those wildflowers against all odds. They signed the documents Margaret had brought with her: marriage certificate, land claim, declaration of homesteading intentions, papers that converted feelings into legalities, that transformed their private arrangement into something recognized by a world that, until then, had tried to decide for them. When Margaret left, promising to return in 2 days with more provisions, the cabin was plunged into a new silence, loaded with meanings to explore. Sarah prepared a simple dinner, conscious of every movement, of the way Daniel followed her with his gaze. The word husband floated in her mind like something foreign and familiar at once. "I can sleep outside tonight," he offered suddenly as they finished dinner. "There's a clear moon." Sarah felt warmth rise to her cheeks but lifted her gaze to meet Daniel's. "No," she responded with a soft but firm voice. "This is your home." "How home?" Later, in the penumbra of the room lit only by the dying glow of the fire, Sarah untied her hair with uncertain fingers. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she watched Daniel approach slowly, as if fearing to break something fragile with his presence. There were no words when he sat beside her, only the sound of their breaths mixing with the occasional crackling of logs. Sarah took Daniel's hand in hers, studying the lines of his palm, the small scars that told stories of work and survival. Then, in a gesture of courage that surprised them both, she brought that rough hand to her cheek. The contact unleashed something primal and sweet at once. Daniel's lips found hers with a tenderness that contained fire. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to fully feel the moment, the texture of his hands on her waist, the scent of wood and earth that emanated from him, the growing warmth that erased the borders between their bodies. When they finally gave themselves to each other, it wasn't just a physical act, but a culmination of all the small shared gestures, the unspoken words, the spaces inhabited together. Sarah discovered that her body had its own language, one that responded to Daniel's touch as flowers respond to the sun. Later, while Daniel slept beside her, Sarah remained awake, watching the shadows dance on the cabin ceiling. She thought about all the decisions that had brought her to this moment, some made by her, others imposed by destiny. For the first time, she didn't feel that life was something that simply happened to her, but something she helped create with each choice. She gently caressed Daniel's hair, marveling at the newly discovered intimacy. "My husband," she thought, testing the word in her mind. And for the first time it didn't sound like a cage, but like an open door toward a future they could build together, brick by brick, day by day. The dawn of the second day as spouses brought dark clouds on the horizon, presage of an uncommon storm for that season. Sarah observed the changing sky from the cabin door, while Daniel reinforced the windows with additional boards. "May storms are treacherous," he commented, hammering the last board. "They come without warning and take what they find." Sarah nodded, thinking how the words also described the threat hanging over them. Margaret Crawford had promised to return today with news of Waverley, but the weather would complicate her journey. They were alone facing whatever came, as they had been from the beginning. At midday, rain began to fall with unexpected force. Sarah prepared bread in the kitchen, plunging her hands into the dough with rhythmic movements that provided her with strange comfort. Kneading had something of ritual, of connection with generations of women who had performed the same gesture for centuries. Her mother had taught her to feel the dough, to recognize when it was ready. "Bread knows when you're listening to it," she used to say. The sound of approaching hooves interrupted her thoughts. It couldn't be Margaret. No sensible person would ride under such a downpour. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and approached the window. Through the curtain of rain, she distinguished 3 silhouettes on horseback approaching the cabin. Daniel, who was repairing a chair, immediately stood and took his rifle. "Stay inside," he said, heading to the door. "If you hear anything strange, go out the back window and run toward the stream." Sarah wanted to protest, but Daniel's expression admitted no discussion. She stayed inside by the window, watching through a crack between the boards. The scene seemed blurry under the incessant rain. Daniel standing on the porch, rifle in hand. The 3 riders stopped a few meters away, water dripping from their hats and capes. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension was visible even at a distance. One of the men, who seemed to lead the group, extended what appeared to be a paper. Daniel didn't take it or move from his position. After a brief exchange, the men slowly retreated and rode away down the road. When Daniel returned inside, his face showed a calm that Sarah recognized as forced. "Waverley's men," he confirmed, shaking the water from his hair. "They brought an order to take you to town under county custody. What did you tell them?" "That you're legally my wife, that we have the papers to prove it, and that this land belongs to us under the Homestead Act," he responded, placing the rifle in its place. They didn't seem impressed. "They'll be back." Sarah returned to her bread dough, working it now with more force, as if she could channel her fear and frustration through her hands. "I won't go," she said finally. "They won't take me from here." Daniel approached and, in an unusual gesture for him, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. The contact, now familiar after shared intimacy, still transmitted a current of warmth that momentarily dispelled worry. "No one will take you anywhere," he assured. "We'll do whatever's necessary." That night, while the storm lashed the cabin with renewed fury, Sarah and Daniel remained awake, listening to the rain beat the roof and windows. Their bodies found comfort in closeness, in shared warmth under the blankets. They didn't make love, but intimacy was present in every touch, in the way their breaths synchronized, in how their intertwined hands seemed to form a silent pact against the outside world. "Are you afraid?" he asked in the darkness. Sarah considered the question. Fear was a constant presence since her parents' death, fear of loneliness, of helplessness, of wrong decisions. But now it was different. It was a shared fear and therefore less heavy to bear. "Yes," she responded honestly, "but I'm not alone." Outside, the wind howled like a living creature. Inside, in the fragile but resistant space they had created, Sarah allowed herself to believe that some storms could be survived, if you had the right hands to hold on to. The morning after the storm dawned with impossible clarity, as if the sky had been washed of all impurity. Sarah went out early to check the damage. Some shingles torn from the roof, a section of fallen fence. The prairie flowers bent but not uprooted. She knelt beside them, carefully straightening the most affected stems. They had the surprising resistance of wild things, she thought. To bend without breaking, to yield to survive. Margaret Crawford arrived at midday, her horse leaving deep tracks in the mud of the road. She brought news and provisions as she had promised. The expression on her face, however, anticipated problems. "Waverley has convinced Judge Thornton to annul your marriage," she announced without preamble, once inside the cabin. "He alleges we didn't have adequate witnesses, and that I exceeded my authority as justice of the peace." Sarah felt the ground move beneath her feet. The silver locket that now hung fro. Daniel's neck seemed to suddenly weigh, as if the metal had turned to lead. "Can he do that?" Daniel asked, his voice controlled but with an edge of anger. "Technically no, but he has the judge in his pocket," Margaret responded. "However, I've sent letters to Washington denouncing his abuses of power. I have friends in the East who can exert pressure." Meanwhile, the woman extracted several papers from her bag and spread them on the table. "I've brought a new marriage certificate, with adequate witnesses from Copper Creek, who have signed as if they were present. And I've modified the date so it appears you married 3 months ago." Sarah looked at the documents with a mixture of relief and unease. More papers, more necessary lies to protect a truth that should have been simple. She had chosen to be here with this man, on this land. "Why are you helping us?" she asked finally, looking at Margaret with genuine curiosity. The older woman remained silent for a moment, as if carefully selecting her words. 15 years ago, Waverley took everything from my sister," she responded at last. "Her farm, her dignity, finally her will to live. Men like him prosper because the rest of us bow our heads. No more." That night, after Margaret departed with the promise to return in a week, Sarah and Daniel sat on the repaired porch, contemplating the stars emerging in the clear sky. The locket shone against Daniel's shirt, catching reflections from the growing moon. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, without taking his gaze from the sky. "Staying? All this?" Sarah considered the question, letting the words find their way from a place of absolute truth. "I regret many things in my life," she began, "not having told my parents how much I loved them, having feared so much that I never learned to ride well. The times I was silent when I should have spoken. She took a breath, feeling the scent of wet earth, of flowers beginning to close their petals with the night. But I don't regret having stayed here. I don't regret you. Daniel then turned to look at her, and in his eyes Sarah saw something she recognized as a form of devotion, so pure it almost hurt to contemplate it. Without words, he took her hand and brought it to his lips, softly kissing her knuckles. The gesture awakened in Sarah a certainty that expanded from her chest to every limb. This moment, this man, this imperfect and threatened life, was what she had chosen, and she would keep choosing it day after day, storm after storm. Colonel Marcus Waverley arrived 3 days later, with 5 men and the wounded pride of someone unaccustomed to being told no. Sarah saw him approach from afar, an imposing figure mounted on a black horse, uniform impeccable despite the heat and dust of the road. Daniel and she had prepared the cabin as for a siege, provisions stored, water in barrels, windows and doors reinforced. But both knew this wasn't a war they could win with barricades. The real weapons would be Margaret Crawford's papers and the ability to stand firm before intimidation. When the riders stopped in front of the cabin, Sarah felt a strange calm, almost supernatural. Fear was still there, but now it shared space with something stronger, the determination of a woman who had found her place in the world and wasn't willing to abandon it. Daniel went out first, rifle in hand though, pointing at the ground. Sarah followed him, placing herself at his side. For the first time, she allowed herself to study the man who had tried to decide her destiny without knowing her. Waverley would be about 50 years old, with a face that could have been handsome, if not for the hardness of his gaze and the severe line of his lips. The type of man, Sarah thought, who confused power with respect. Brennan, Waverley greeted with a barely perceptible nod of his head. "I see you've ignored my orders." "I don't take orders from you, Colonel," Daniel responded with a tranquility Sarah knew was feigned. "This is our legal property. My wife and I are established here under the Homestead Act." Waverley smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Your wife? I understand that marriage has been annulled for irregularities." Sarah stepped forward, feeling the afternoon sun on her face. "You're referring to our first marriage, Colonel Waverley," she said, taking Margaret's papers from her dress pocket. "But we were married for the first time 3 months ago in Copper Creek, with all the necessary witnesses." She extended the documents, which one of Waverley's men took and handed to his chief. The colonel's face hardened as he read, his eyes narrowing like those of a thwarted predator. "These papers could be forged," he suggested, though his tone had lost some conviction. "You can verify it with the witnesses," Sarah responded. "They're all respectable citizens of Copper Creek. Mr. Jenkins, Reverend Watts, Mrs. Sullivan, the names, carefully chosen by Margaret among people who had left the territory months ago, were impossible to verify in the short term." Waverley knew it. Sarah saw the calculation in his eyes, the evaluation of risks and possibilities. "Even so," the colonel continued, changing strategy, "this land is in dispute. The railroad company has expansion plans that include this valley." "We have legal title," Daniel intervened, "and we've complied with all homesteading requirements, permanent housing, established crops, property improvements." He pointed toward the small orchard they had expanded, the flowers that now formed a colorful border around the cabin, the rebuilt fence, the well improved with a new extraction system. The silence that followed was tense as a bowstring. Sarah could feel the frustration emanating from Waverley in almost palpable waves. It was the silence of a powerful man facing unexpected obstacles. "This isn't over, Brennan," he said finally, turning his horse. "Laws change, circumstances too." When the riders rode away, raising golden dust under the afternoon sun, Sarah and Daniel remained standing in front of the cabin, shoulder to shoulder, until the figures were lost on the horizon. "He'll be back," Daniel murmured. "I know," Sarah responded, "but we'll be here too." That afternoon, while the sky tinged orange and purple, Sarah planted more seeds around the cabin. Not just flowers this time, but medicinal herbs, resistant vegetables, plants her mother had taught her to recognize and value. Each seed buried in the earth was a declaration of permanence, an act of faith in the future. Daniel watched her from the porch, carving a new wooden figure. This time it wasn't a bird, but the shape of a woman standing with her face lifted toward the sky, as if defying the storm. Summer arrived with implacable heat that made the air tremble over the earth. Sarah had adapted her routine. She woke before dawn to work in the orchard, and tasks requiring physical effort, rested during the hottest hours, and resumed activities when the sun began its descent toward the horizon. A month had passed since Waverley's visit, and though he hadn't returned in person, his shadow projected over them in the form of rumours brought by travellers and merchants. He was trying to influence territorial authorities, searching for legal technicalities to invalidate their land claim. Margaret Crawford visited the cabin every 2 weeks, bringing provisions, news, and most valuable books. Sarah devoured these readings during afternoon siestas, feeding a mind that had always been hungry for knowledge. History, geography, herbal medicine, literature. Each page read was a window to worlds that transcended the limitations of her current life. "You should teach reading," Margaret suggested during her last visit, observing Sarah finish a volume on medicinal plants. There are many women in nearby settlements who never had the opportunity. The idea germinated in Sarah like one of her seeds, slowly at first, then with roots that extended and deepened. She began to imagine the cabin transformed a couple days a week, with women of different ages gathered around the table, discovering letters, forming words, finding power in the ability to read for themselves. One night, while Daniel repaired tools by lamplight, Sarah shared this nascent vision with him. "We could build a larger table," he responded after considering it a moment, "and maybe a bookshelf for the books." He didn't ask why, nor express doubts about the idea of converting their home into a community space. He simply accepted that this was the path she had chosen, and that he would be there to support her. At the end of July, the first woman arrived, Maria Gonzalez, wife of a miner who worked in the nearby hills. Shy at first, with limited English, but with a determination Sarah recognized immediately. 2 sisters from a neighboring farm followed, then a widow raising her children alone, then the teenage daughter of a blacksmith. By September, 8 women were meeting twice a week in the expanded cabin, which now had a long table built by Daniel and shelves that housed books donated by Margaret and other sympathizers from town. The lessons went beyond reading. They shared knowledge about traditional medicine, sewing techniques, food preservation. Sarah discovered a version of herself she didn't know existed, a natural teacher, capable of connecting with women from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. Her voice, once soft and contained, had acquired new firmness when explaining letters or debating the meaning of a text. In those meetings, Daniel withdrew discreetly, occupying himself with outdoor tasks or visiting nearby settlements to exchange products. But each night upon returning, he listened with genuine interest, while Sarah told him about her students' progress, their stories, their newly awakened dreams. "You're building something important," he told her one night, while they shared a simple dinner of stew and homemade bread. "Something that will last beyond us." Sarah felt the weight of those words, their beauty and responsibility. She took Daniel's hand across the table, feeling the texture of calluses and small scars under her fingers. "We're building it together," she gently corrected. "Every board you place, every tool you repair, makes this space possible." That night, in the intimacy of their bed, the love they shared had a different quality. It was no longer the urgent discovery of early times, nor the confirmation of mutual belonging, but a serene celebration of what they were creating together. Their bodies knew each other now, knew how to awaken pleasure in the other, how to communicate with caresses what sometimes words couldn't express. Afterward, while Daniel slept deeply, Sarah remained awake, contemplating the moonlight filtering through the curtains. In that moment of perfect stillness, she understood they were taking root in a way that intertwined not only between them, but with the earth, with the community beginning to form around them, with a future that extended beyond what they could imagine. The prairie flowers she had planted months ago now gave seeds that the wind scattered. Sarah smiled at the perfect metaphor. That's how ideas, dreams, small revolutions were. They began in intimate, protected spaces, to then be carried by the wind to unsuspected places. Autumn gave way to an early winter, with snowfalls that transformed the landscape into a white and silent canvas. The cabin, now expanded with an additional room and a more resistant porch, became a warm refuge against the cold outside. Classes continued, though less frequently due to difficulties traveling the snowy roads. The women who arrived brought stories from town, news about the railroad's advance, rumors about Waverley, and his constant maneuvers to expand his influence. One December morning, while Sarah checked the supplies stored for winter, she found something unexpected, a damp spot on her dress at chest height. She remained still, remembering her mother's words years ago when she explained the signals of the female body. She mentally counted the days, the weeks, and the realization struck her with the force of a revelation. She spent the rest of the day in a state of altered consciousness, performing her usual tasks while her mind explored this new reality. A child, a life growing inside her, the ultimate extension of what she and Daniel had created together. When he returned at dusk, bringing firewood for the stove, Sarah observed his figure outlined against the waning light. Daniel had changed subtly in these months. He was still lean and strong, but his movements now had a quiet security, the confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "I'm pregnant," Sarah said simply. When he entered and shook the snow from his boots, Daniel remained motionless, arms still loaded with firewood, eyes fixed on her as if seeing something completely new. Then slowly, he placed the firewood beside the stove and approached Sarah. His hands, trembling, settled softly on her still flat belly. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, covering his hands with hers. "It will be spring when the baby is born," she said. The season of beginnings. That night, while snow fell silently outside, they made plans by the fire. Daniel would speak with Margaret about bringing a midwife when the time approached. They would expand the cabin again as soon as the weather allowed, adding a small room for the baby. They would plant more vegetables in spring, perhaps get a cow for fresh milk. "We should choose a name," Daniel suggested, while carving a small wooden cradle, a project he had begun barely an hour after receiving the news. "Something that means something to us." Sarah ran her fingers over the surface of the silver locket Daniel had returned to her months ago, arguing it should remain in the family, that someday it would be for their son or daughter. "If it's a girl," she said thoughtfully, "I'd like to call her Lily, like the wildflowers that grow where no one would expect to find beauty." Daniel smiled, nodding in approval. "And if it's a boy, it could be Thomas," he offered. "It was my grandfather's name. It means twin. I like to think our son would have two natures, the strength to survive in this hard land and the sensitivity to appreciate its beauty." As winter advanced, Sarah's belly grew, transforming her silhouette and her way of moving through the world. The women who attended classes brought advice, home remedies, small knitted garments for the baby. News of the coming arrival had spread like ripples in a pond, reaching even to Copper Creek. One February afternoon, when winter was beginning to show the first signs of exhaustion, Margaret Crawford arrived with important news. The letters sent to Washington had produced results. An official investigation into Waverly was underway, and several of his properties had been placed under scrutiny for possible irregular appropriations. "It may take months, even a year," Margaret warned, "but his power is diminishing. He no longer has the unconditional support he used to have." That night, while melted snow dripped from the roof in a constant rhythm announcing the change of season, Sarah felt the baby move inside her with particular energy. She took Daniel's hand and placed it on the spot where the little kicks were most perceptible. "Feel," she whispered. "It's dancing." Daniel, amazed, kept his hand on Sarah's belly, following the movements of the small being they had created together. On his face was an expression of pure wonder, of reverence before the mystery of life growing under his palm. "It's like the seeds," he said finally. "They spent all winter under the snow preparing to emerge." Sarah smiled at the perfect comparison. That's how the life they had built was, seeds planted with faith, nurtured through difficult seasons, trusting that spring would always inevitably return. 5 years had passed since that day beside the dry riverbed. The original cabin was now barely recognizable, expanded and transformed into a solid 3-room house with a wide porch facing east, where the sun rose each morning. The valley that had once seemed desolate now flourished with carefully planned crops, young fruit trees beginning to bear their first fruits, and patches of wildflowers Sarah had deliberately sown, allowing beauty to exist alongside the practical. Marcus Waverly had left the territory 2 years ago, stripped of much of his properties after the federal investigation. His departure had opened space for families like Sarah and Daniel's to establish themselves more firmly, without the constant shadow of threat. The informal school that had begun at her kitchen table was now its own building, built with the help of the husbands and fathers of her students, halfway between several settlements. 3 days a week, Sarah taught there not only reading and writing, but history, basic sciences, and most importantly, the idea that women could and should chart their own destinies. That May afternoon, Sarah watched her 4-year-old daughter Lily run among the prairie flowers that bordered the path to the house. The girl had Daniel's dark hair and Sarah's light eyes, but her spirit seemed entirely her own, untamed, curious, full of a joy that found wonders in the simplest things. Lily stopped to pick a particularly showy flower, one of the species Sarah had planted that first year. The girl examined it with the seriousness of a scientist, turning it between her small fingers to observe it from all angles. "Mama!" she called, running towards Sarah with the flower held high. "What's this one called?" Sarah took the flower, pretending to consider it deeply, though she knew the answer. "This is a lily," she responded with solemnity. "Like you." The girl's eyes widened, divided between disbelief and delight. "Really?" she asked, taking the flower again. "It has my name?" "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "Because it's beautiful and strong, and grows where others say nothing should bloom." Lily smiled, satisfied with the explanation, and ran back to the flower field. Sarah watched her go, thinking about how the stories we tell shape the world we inhabit. Someday she would explain that the flower had another name in books, but that here in this valley, they had transformed with work and love. She had the right to call it what she wanted. Daniel returned at dusk, bringing wood and provisions from town. Sarah watched him unload the wagon with efficient movements, admiring how the years had turned him into a man in the full sense of the word. It wasn't just physical maturity, but an inner presence, a solidity that radiated from him without needing to impose itself. "I brought something," he said, approaching her with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I found it at the news store." Sarah unwrapped the package with curiosity. It was a blue-covered book, Botany of the American West. Her fingers traced the illustrated pages with detailed drawings of plants and flowers from the region, many of which she recognized from her own gardens. "For your classes," Daniel explained, "and for Lily to learn the names of everything that grows here." Sarah hugged the book to her chest, moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift, by how Daniel understood what was important to her, without need for grand declarations. That night, after putting Lily to bed with a story about flowers that changed color according to moonlight, Sarah and Daniel sat on the porch, as they had done countless times over the years. The sky was clear, dotted with stars so bright they seemed within reach. "Sometimes I think about that day by the dry river," Sarah said, contemplating the horizon, where mountains outlined against the night sky, how I was willing to disappear, how I thought there was nothing left for me in this world. Daniel took her hand, a gesture that had acquired the comfort of the everyday, but had never lost its power to comfort her. "Life is strange," he reflected. "Sometimes it takes us exactly where we need to be." "Even though the path seems a senseless detour," Sarah nodded, thinking about all the circumstances that had led to this moment. The loss of her parents, the settler's abandonment, the drought that had left her beside that dry riverbed, Daniel's journey that had taken him down that road precisely that day. "Margaret asked me yesterday if we're happy," Sarah commented. "It seemed like a strange question." "And what did you answer?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Sarah considered the question, letting the answer emerge from a deep and true place. "I told her that happiness is like wildflowers. It's not always there, it comes in seasons, sometimes surprisingly after the hardest periods. But when it appears, you have to recognize it, appreciate it, and remember its color for difficult times," Daniel smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "An answer worthy of a teacher," he joked affectionately. Sarah rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, feeling the familiar warmth of his body, the constant rhythm of his breathing. In the house behind them, Lily slept surrounded by objects that told their family's story. The silver locket that would someday be hers, the wooden figures Daniel had carved over the years, the books Sarah treasured, the seeds saved from each harvest. The wind brought the scent of night flowers, those that only opened their petals when the sun set. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself to fully feel this moment of peace. She didn't know what challenges the future would bring. Life in the territory continued to be hard, unpredictable, but she had learned that deep roots survive the fiercest storms. The prairie flowers she had planted that first year had given seeds the wind had scattered. Now they grew not only around the cabin, but in unexpected places in the valley, beside rocks, among crops, along the path. Small, stubborn colonizers who insisted on existing and beautifying the world in their own way. Like herself, Sarah thought. Like all those who dare to bloom where no one would expect to find beauty.